Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
You don't belong at the head table. That's for achievers, my Aunt Diane said in that breezy voice she saves for announcements that sound like policy, and I could feel a dozen heads tilt in that casual, family way that pretends not to be listening while soaking up every crumb, and I nodded like it was fine, like of course I understood the rules of her little kingdom, while something in me that has been quiet for years sat up, stretched, and said, "Actually, no. We are not doing this again." I did not argue, because I learned a long time ago that people like Diane love a scene they can narrate later as proof that you are difficult, and because I know how to stand there and let the comment land, keep my face friendly, add a small laugh to signal no hard feelings, then file the moment like a receipt I will use when I need it, and if that sounds calculating, it is, because I grew up in a family where points are awarded for job titles, where everyone knows which cousin has a house with more bathrooms and whose kid got into the school with the bumper sticker status, and where my choices were always labeled as interesting with that tone that means not impressive. Diane has been running the reunion since forever, and she treats it like a gala even though it is basically folding chairs, a sign-in sheet, and a group text full of reminders about potato salad. And every year she sets a head table like it is a charity banquet, and every year the same rotation appears there. The cousin who went into wealth management, the cousin who married a dentist and posts about it, the cousin who can recite their job title like a chant. And every year I sit somewhere near the end with the kids who are home from college and the uncles who tell the same story, and I make it a point not to mind, which is to say I mind and then swallow it, because in this family the only acceptable feelings are pride and nostalgia. The thing no one knows, and the part that makes me smile even while she assigns me to the overflow table like a piece of luggage, is that the last few years I have been working on something that does not play well at reunions, because it has been built mostly in silence, with contracts that kept my mouth shut, with success that did not look like success until it did, and I learned to let relatives believe I was drifting, when the truth was that I was grinding, and if they could not see it, I stopped needing them to, which is a nice story to tell yourself until the moment someone points at a chair and says you do not belong there. Diane did the thing she loves, the soft smile, the hand to the shoulder, the suggestion dressed as kindness, and she said, "You'll be more comfortable near the cousins. The head table is for the achievers we are highlighting this year," and I thought, there it is. The word highlighted like a high school yearbook superlative, and I wondered who made the list this time, and I also wondered if anyone would ever admit that in this family the scoreboard has always been rigged, because the definition of achievement is whatever Diane can explain in a toast without needing to understand it. I am telling you this like we are sitting across from each other, because that is how it feels in my head. The coffee is warm, the memory is fresher than I want it to be, and underneath the irritation there is a steadiness that surprises me. Because I did not flinch, I did not beg for a seat, I did not start reciting work wins like a contestant on a game show. I just said, "Of course," and she relaxed, because she thought the issue was closed, and when she moved on to direct the caterer and arrange the place cards and rehearse her little speech in her head, I pulled out my phone and opened an email that had arrived that morning with the subject line I had read twice, and then once more for luck. I am not going to spill everything yet, because part of what carried me through this was not just the win itself, but the timing, the ironclad precision of it, the way it sat like a sealed envelope in my bag while my aunt organized chairs. And the part you need to know is that an award I never talked about publicly, from people who do not care about Diane's version of success, had just been confirmed, and the physical symbol of it, which is not subtle and not small, would be ready the same day as the reunion, which felt like the universe finally decided to have a sense of humor. It is funny how a family can decide who you are and then refuse to update the file, and I could have walked up right then and told her, "Hey, quick note, the next time you print out place cards you might want to make one for me at the head table." But it would have turned into a debate about what counts as real, which would have turned into her rolling her eyes at words like innovation and partnership and impact, and I did not want to argue definitions. I wanted to alter the room without raising my voice, so I kept my face friendly and my voice light, and I asked whether she needed any help with last-minute logistics, and she said she had it under control, which is her favorite sentence, so I nodded and said that sounded perfect. Then I stepped away to the side hallway, the one that always smells like cleaning supplies and old flyers, and I called the number in the email, and a real person answered, and I introduced myself in the calmest voice I could manage. And I asked whether a courier service they recommended could deliver to a private event space, and the woman on the other end said that would be easy if someone on site could sign, and I said there would absolutely be someone who loves to sign for things, and I gave the location, the time window, the entrance to use, and the instruction that my name should be announced clearly when they arrived, which felt like setting up a spotlight without needing a stage. When I hung up, I texted my cousin Becca, who handles the check-in table every year because she is organized and a little bored, and I told her I was arranging a delivery of something I needed for a quick moment during the program, nothing messy, nothing loud, just something I wanted to donate in honor of our grandparents, and if that sounds manipulative, yes, it was gentle manipulation, but it was also true, because the win I was holding on to began with the habits they taught me, and Becca, who has always liked me even when she does not understand me, said she would make sure the front door crew knew to page me when the delivery arrived, and would I please give her a heads up if this was going to cause drama, and I said no drama, quick and clean. You have my word. Back in the main room, Diane was lining up the name cards like soldiers, and I watched her place my card at the end near the coffee urn, and I felt the old heat crawl up my neck, and I breathed it down. And I reminded myself that people who need to be seen first will sometimes force others to be seen last, and the only real way to interrupt that habit is to refuse to fight for scraps and instead change the table. And I realized I was done waiting for permission from people who do not even know the game I am playing, and that was the moment, not the award, not the email, not the courier confirmation, but that private click in my chest that said enough. So when she walked past me again and asked if I was all set with my seat and if I needed directions to the cousins section, I smiled in a way that must have looked like I was grateful, and I said I was all set, and I thanked her for all her work, because she does work hard, even if the way she uses it is a mess. And then I looked at the time on my phone and saw the window I had arranged sitting right there like a held breath, and I thought about the first toast she always gives, the one where she raises her glass and declares the family legacy alive and well at the head table, and I pictured something else happening as that glass went up, and I will admit I felt a flicker of petty joy that was not my best self, but was absolutely honest. By the time the cousins started arriving and the chatter filled the room, my phone buzzed with a simple confirmation message from the courier service that read, in the politest language possible, that the delivery was scheduled exactly for the start of the opening remarks, which is to say the moment Diane loves most, and I put the phone face down. I took my seat where she had placed me. I folded the name card in half just to have something to do with my hands, and I told myself I would not have to explain a thing when the door opened and someone called my name, and the funny part, the part that still makes me shake my head, is that for once I did not need the room to clap, I just needed them to see. If you have ever had relatives who keep a running scoreboard in their heads and pretend it is objective when it is actually a highlight reel of things they understand, you will get why I stopped offering updates a long time ago. Because every time I tried to explain the work I was doing, I watched their eyes glaze over at words like pilot program and user adoption and security review, and after a while I decided that peace costs less than convincing people, so I said less and did more. And while Diane was busy handing out gold stars for things she could put into a toast, I was spending evenings and weekends building something that did not photograph well but fixed problems for people who did not have the time to wait for a committee. And the weird part is that I did not hide it to be mysterious. I hid it because talking about it turned into a referendum on whether it counted, which is exhausting when your audience wants a ribbon and you are talking about results. There were years that did not look like progress to anyone but the few clients who stuck with me while I learned how to stop promising every feature and start solving one stubborn problem better than anyone else. And there were months when I took contract work that looked like a step backward, but paid for the legal fees that came with landing a bigger partner. And there were whole stretches where the only sign that I was moving forward was that I was finally sleeping because I trusted my own roadmap, and none of that plays in a family group chat where the wins are new cars, new titles, and vacation photos with captions about balance. So when people joked that I was still finding myself, I laughed along, because it kept the conversation from turning into a cross-examination. The thing that shifted everything was a pilot with a mid-sized chain that did not want publicity until they were sure the implementation would stick, which meant non-disclosure agreements and quiet progress and a calendar full of calls that I never mentioned to anyone at home. And when the metrics started to move in the right direction, they told their association, which nominated me for an award I did not apply for. And to be honest, I almost deleted the first email because it sounded like spam. And by the time I understood it was real, they had already done the due diligence and voted, which was equal parts flattering and terrifying, because it meant I could not control when it became public. And as fate or karma or just ordinary scheduling would have it, the formal notification landed the same morning as the reunion, with a line about a ceremonial delivery that made me sit down at my kitchen table and just breathe. I did not tell Diane, and not because I wanted to blindside her for sport, but because I knew the conversation would collapse into her asking me to summarize the significance in a way that would fit between the salad and the first toast. And I knew that I would start translating, and by the end of the translation the win would sound smaller, and I have done that too many times in my life, shrinking something that took years so it would fit under someone else's ceiling. So I closed the laptop. I poured coffee. And I decided that if the universe was handing me timing this clean, I would honor it by being intentional, which is a fancy way of saying I would make sure the moment did not get buried under the usual family noise. There is a scholarship fund in our family that Diane loves to mention because she chairs the committee, and every year there is a 5-minute slot where she thanks the donors and reminds everyone of the application deadlines and the success stories. And the rule, which she quotes like scripture, is that any gift made in honor of our grandparents gets recognized at the start of the program, no exceptions, which is exactly the kind of rule that sounds generous and is also a way of controlling the spotlight. And I have never tested that rule because I never cared to compete with her agenda, but that morning I called Uncle Ray, who is the treasurer and a stickler for procedure in a way that is almost comforting. And I told him I wanted to make a gift that would expand the fund for students who were building something on their own, not just chasing titles, and he was so pleased he started listing ways we could phrase the announcement. And I said there was one line I needed included because it meant a lot to me, and I read it to him carefully, my full name followed by a plain statement that the gift was made in honor of our grandparents and in recognition of an industry award confirmed that week, and he said that would be entirely appropriate and, in fact, expected, because the bylaws encouraged mentioning why a donor chose that moment, and he promised to send the acknowledgement within the hour. If you are wondering whether I felt like I was gaming the system, I did not, because the only system I have ever asked this family to honor is the one where effort matters even when it is quiet. And all I did was claim the one slot in the program that could not be vetoed by preference or personality, which is what rules are for when humans get messy. And I will admit there was a private thrill in realizing that I had finally used the language Diane loves to wield in service of something she has never seen as worthy until it arrives with a label she understands, and if that sounds petty, maybe it is, but it is also honest. I sent the signed pledge and the announcement language to Uncle Ray, and because I know how these things get lost, I copied Becca and the venue manager and asked for a printed card at the lectern, just a simple line with my name and the sentence we agreed on. And the manager replied that their staff would prepare it and place it before doors opened, and Becca texted me a thumbs up, which in our family is as binding as a contract, and then I sat for a moment and laughed, not because I thought I had outsmarted anyone, but because it felt like the first time I had chosen timing as deliberately as I choose my friends. An hour later, Diane sent a group message reminding everyone of the order of events and her first bullet point, which of course was not a bullet point because she prefers paragraphs, said she would open with a welcome and a gratitude moment, and I replied all very politely that Uncle Ray would be handling a brief scholarship acknowledgement first per the bylaws, and there was a pause that I could feel through the phone, and then a reply from Uncle Ray with the exact bylaw phrasing that said, Donor acknowledgements in honor of our grandparents precede opening remarks, and Diane wrote back that of course she was aware, and she hoped everyone would be concise, and I stared at those words and thought, that is the closest I will ever get to her saying please do not steal my thunder, and I put the phone face down and let myself enjoy it. By the time I parked outside the venue, the courier had texted to confirm the delivery window and ask for the point of contact at the front door, which I gave them along with Becca's table number. And while I walked in, I saw the program card on the lectern with my name in print and the sentence that would make every single person in that room stop doing the casual math they always do about who belongs where. And if you are waiting for the moment of revenge in this chapter, it was not loud and it was not cruel. It was that I used Diane's favorite rule to move her off the very first word, which meant the evening would start not with a gatekeeper blessing her chosen achievers, but with the truth that the person she had sent to the overflow table had put money behind the next kid who builds something without permission, and the announcement would land before she could frame it. And the one thing she loves more than being in charge is following the rules in public, so she would smile and clap, and I would not have to explain a thing, and that felt like justice I could live with. The thing about these reunions is that the choreography is so predictable you could run it like a drill, which is exactly why a small change lands like a fire alarm. And I knew that as soon as I saw the program card at the lectern with Uncle Ray's neat note on top, I had already nudged the first domino. Because once he reads a line, he will not skip it, and once he holds a microphone, he becomes the version of himself that coached debate in high school, careful and exact and not interested in anyone's feelings about the order of events, and that is why I love him, because when the room tries to slide into Diane's version of how things should go, he politely wraps both hands around the facts and refuses to let them drift. I checked in with Becca at the front table, and the first thing she asked was whether my delivery would cause chaos, and I said it would not. It would only interrupt the part of the evening that most enjoys hearing itself speak. And she laughed because she knew exactly what I meant, and then she said Diane had been circling the lectern like a hawk and muttering about keeping things tight, and I told her not to worry because Uncle Ray had the card in his suit pocket, and, unlike the place cards my aunt moves around whenever her mood shifts, that card was not going anywhere until it was read, and she made a face that said she would buy popcorn for this if that were allowed. I wish I could tell you I was calm enough to sit and chat, but the truth is my stomach had that heavy, electric feeling you get before you do anything that can't be undone, and even though I had promised myself I would not narrate my worth to anyone, I kept rehearsing tiny answers in my head to questions I knew would come later, little explanations for people who would suddenly care now that something they could measure had landed on my name, and every time I caught myself doing it I reminded myself that I was not here to educate anyone. I was here to change one room for one evening and let the rest take care of itself. When Diane spotted me near the back, she nodded in that polite way people do when they want to appear gracious while confirming you are where they placed you, and I nodded back like a reasonable person, then turned to greet my cousins, who were already competing to retell familiar triumphs, and if you have lived through this you will recognize the script. The careful praise for promotions that came with titles longer than job descriptions, the updates about kids that sound like press releases, the pointed questions about whether I was still doing my little projects, as if work is only real when it appears on a billboard, and I listened and smiled and asked good questions, because I am not here to fight with them. I am here to do something clean that they will not be able to unsee. The room filled the way it always does, which is to say too fast, and then suddenly we were at capacity and the murmur dropped on cue as Diane stepped toward the mic, and she had that rehearsed smile that makes people lean in, and she reached for the stand. And, before her fingers touched it, Uncle Ray placed his hand on the bass and thanked her for the warm welcome and said that per our long-standing practice, he would begin with the donor acknowledgement in honor of our grandparents, and I watched her blink as if a glass had slipped out of her hands, and then I watched her recover with a gracious gesture that probably looked smooth to most of the room. And I stayed seated because I knew my line was coming, and I did not want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me hover. Uncle Ray read exactly what we had agreed on, each word clear and unhurried, my full name, the purpose of the gift, the expansion of the fund to include young people building something on their own. And then the phrase that attached my family name to an industry recognition confirmed that week, and you could feel the air change in that subtle way a room changes when people decide to update their opinions, a soundless shift that registers as a collective O. And because Ray knows the rituals better than anyone, he followed with the old custom he loves to enforce, inviting the donor to join the head table for the opening toast, since that is where the first glasses are raised in our grandparents' honor. And because that custom has been around forever, even Diane could not kill it without looking petty, so she smiled with a tightness at the edges and gestured to the empty chair beside her as if it had been waiting for me all along. I stood up slowly, not milking it, just moving like a person who has done this before even though I had not, and I walked the short distance to the front and took the seat that has never been offered to me. And I kept my hands folded because I did not trust them not to tremble, and for a second I thought, this is enough. This right here is enough, because the rule Diane keeps in her back pocket had just been used in front of everyone to alter her favorite seating chart. And I did not have to raise my voice or ask for permission or argue for definitions. I just had to show up at the exact moment when the structure she worships did what it is supposed to do and honored the person who actually moved something forward. You want revenge in ways that are not loud or cruel, and this was one of them, because I sat where I had been told I did not belong and no one could object without revealing how much the hierarchy mattered to them. And even the cousins who loved to joke about my little projects kept their faces arranged in pleasant support because the socially safe choice had shifted under their feet. And while Diane lifted her glass and spoke her well-worn words about legacy and example and family pride, I could feel her balancing two competing needs, the need to be magnanimous in public and the need to reassert control. And she did what she always does in moments like that. She added a line about the importance of humility, which was meant to be a nudge. And I accepted it like it was meant for the whole room rather than for me, because I had no interest in letting her drag me into a private skirmish in front of an audience. When the toast ended, I leaned toward her and thanked her for keeping the tradition alive, and I said it in a way that left no room for argument about who had just been seated where. And she smiled like we were co-hosts and said she was delighted to recognize generosity, and in that moment I let myself enjoy a small, petty satisfaction that would have embarrassed me on another day, because the seat she guards like a throne had just made room without her permission, and that is the kind of turn that heals something you do not realize has been bruised for years until it stops hurting. I wish I could tell you the night ended right there with a tidy bow, but the truth is the bigger thing had not happened yet. And I knew it was coming because my phone buzzed in my pocket with a short message that the delivery was 3 minutes out and the front desk would page my name on arrival. And I looked down the table and saw Diane take a breath like she was about to launch into her long introduction of the so-called achievers, and I let her begin, because I am not cruel, and I waited until I heard my name called from the entrance with a clear, professional tone that cut through the noise, and I stood up gently, murmured an apology to the table I had not been invited to for years, and walked toward the door while every head turned to see what, exactly, was arriving with my name on it. When I reached the entrance, the front desk volunteer, who was new and did not know any of the family politics, looked relieved to see me because the courier had rolled in something heavy on a dolly and asked for a signature and a clear path. And she handed me the clipboard while apologizing for interrupting the program, and I told her she had nothing to apologize for because we were right on time. Then I turned to the delivery guy, who had the bored patience of someone who has seen every kind of event, and I confirmed my name and the instructions, and he nodded and lifted the cover like it was any other package while, behind us, the room noise shifted the way a crowd shifts when a ball changes direction, not loud. Just a quiet reorientation toward whatever is happening now. I signed, thanked him, and asked the volunteer to page me again, not because I needed the attention, but because I wanted it to be clear that this was not a sneaky stunt in a hallway. This was an arrival with receipts. And when my name floated into the room a second time, I took the base of the trophy, which was heavier than I expected and smooth from all the hands that had already set it in and out of crates. And the courier studied the top while we walked it through the main doors as cleanly as we could, and I kept my eyes on Uncle Ray because he was the only person I trusted to understand that none of this was about drama. It was about putting proof in front of people who had always asked for proof. And when he met my eyes, he gave the tiniest nod that said, "Yes, proceed." Diane's face did something I had never seen before. A quick uncertainty like a pause button got pressed, and then she pasted on the gracious host expression she can hold for hours. And she said into the mic that we seemed to have a delivery for one of our own, and how fun was that? And her tone was light, but her eyes were doing math, and I felt a small and not entirely kind satisfaction at watching her calculate, and I am not proud of that. Except maybe I am, because part of why this hurt for so long is that people like her do their math in silence and treat you accordingly, and the only answer that ever changes the equation is a sum they cannot argue with. I positioned the trophy to the side of the lectern where everyone could see it, but it was not blocking anyone, because I am not here to wreck her program, and when the cover came off there was that soft intake people do when something is bigger than they imagined. And I kept my hands steady and my voice level as I said to the room that I would be brief, that I was grateful, that this recognition belonged to the teams who built with me and the clients who took a risk, and that the only reason I was bringing it into this room was because our grandparents taught us that work done honestly is worth putting your name on even if it takes longer to explain, which is a sentence I knew would hit Uncle Ray square in the heart and would force the cousins to remember the house rules they like to quote when it suits them. I did not look at Diane when I said I was parking the trophy next to the head table for the evening as a temporary loan, because I wanted the kids to take photos with it, and because I wanted it to sit where the so-called achievers had been sitting for years. And the room gave that polite ripple of appreciation that you get when people are both impressed and unsure how to recalibrate their previous comments, and in that ripple I heard exactly what I had been waiting to hear my entire adult life, which was silence from the people who never stopped narrating me as almost, and I will not lie, it landed like relief in a place I did not know was tight. Diane moved toward the microphone as if to fold this into her script, and I could see her almost ask for a round of applause and then launch into a toast that would reframe the moment as a celebration of the family brand rather than of the person standing in front of her, so I stepped half a pace forward, thanked the courier one more time to signal that my mic time was still active, and said I also had a quick note for Uncle Ray as treasurer, because the gift I pledged that morning was not only to expand the fund but to add a small, boring administrative amendment that would make sense to anyone who has ever managed volunteers, and I handed him the sealed envelope we had discussed over the phone, which contained the acknowledgement plus one change that had been quietly approved earlier in the week, and I asked him, with my most innocent face, if he could read it aloud so we could keep our records tidy. You could feel Diane react to the phrase boring administrative amendment the way a cat reacts to a bath, because she hates anything she cannot narrate as glamorous, but she is not going to stop a treasurer from reading procedure in public, and Uncle Ray, bless him, adjusted his glasses and read the sentence exactly as written, which said that for the coming year the scholarship committee would add a donor representative to co-chair the selection process in order to broaden the view of what counts as achievement, and that the position would be held by the donor who made the expansion possible, and someone near the back let out one of those surprised laughs that is not mean, just delighted, and in that moment I did not gloat, I just breathed. Because the thing I wanted was not revenge by microphone, it was a structural change that would live past this evening and keep a chair open for kids who build outside the usual picture frames. Diane recovered like a pro, because she is a pro at this particular game, and she clasped her hands and said what a wonderful idea to include more perspectives, and how thrilled she was to work closely with a donor representative. And I thanked her for her openness and said I looked forward to learning from the process, and if you think I was being saintly, I was not, I was being diplomatic, because I could feel the room watching for any hint that this would turn into a fight, and I was not going to give them a messy scene they could dismiss as family gossip. I was going to give them a clean turn that even the people who do not like me would have to admit made sense. Here is the part one have not said aloud to anyone but you. As I set the envelope down and took my seat again, my phone buzzed with one more message from the award board. A simple line asking whether I would permit a short congratulatory statement from their director to be read at the end of the program, which was a courtesy I had not expected and an opening I had not planned for. And I stared at that line and thought about what it would mean to let an outside voice speak in this room where the only voices that have ever counted are family ones, and I looked at the head table and at the trophy and at Diane's composed face. And I realized I was about to decide whether to close this night with quiet satisfaction or to play one final card that would settle the matter for a very long time, and I do not mind telling you that my hand shook a little as I typed my answer. I stared at the message from the award board, and I knew that if I said yes to a closing statement, it would shift the night from a clean correction to a full rewrite. And for a breath, I worried that it would look like gloating or like I needed out-of-town validation to make a point. But then I remembered how many times I had let other people define my scale because I was afraid of being called too much. And I typed back that a short statement would be appreciated, that it should be simple, that it should credit teams and clients, that it should acknowledge the values my grandparents drilled into us, and that it should be read at the very end with no fanfare, just the facts. And I put the phone down and told myself that if it felt like a lot, it was only because I had trained myself to ask for less than what I had earned. The program rolled on and Diane tried to pace the evening back into its previous shape, and I will give her this. She is a polished host who can surf over a rip current with a smile, so she introduced her list. She praised the cousin with the shiny title and the cousin with the social feed that looks like a catalog, and she threw me a line about generosity that was designed to be gracious, and also to park me in the donor box rather than the builder box. And I accepted it with the nod of a person who is not here to debate labels, because the labels are about to be repainted anyway, and all the while Uncle Ray kept the little card in his pocket like a safety pin holding the whole dress together. When the last presentation ended and the room did that shuffle people do when they think it is over, Uncle Ray stood up with that firm posture that says, "No, we are not finished." And he thanked Diane for the program and thanked the volunteers and then said there was one final courtesy we had been asked to allow, a brief congratulatory note from the independent board that had recognized a member of our family earlier that day. And he held up a single page the way a judge holds up a verdict, not dramatic, just definitive, and Diane's face made a micro-expression that read like an internal weather report. Then she smiled at the room and said what a lovely surprise, and she stepped back. The note itself was short, and I was grateful for that because long praise gives people time to get cynical. But this one landed like a clean stamp. The director's name, the board's unanimous vote, the language about measurable impact and responsible growth. The confirmation that the ridiculous trophy at the front of the room was not theater but protocol, and the line that tugged at the room's attention harder than anything else, the invitation for me to serve as the board's advisory chair for the coming year, which is not a sash, it is work, the kind of work that no one in my family has ever seen because it does not exist on a poster. And as the words sat there, I looked around and watched people rearrange their mental seating charts in real time. And I let the silence do the only job I needed from it, which was to erase the old story. I stood and thanked them without ceremony, because the last thing I wanted was to turn the final minute into a victory lap, and I said I would keep this quick because people were ready for dessert and gossip. And then I said I would be a bad co-chair if I did not use the one specific power the committee had just given me, which was to set one immediate policy for the coming year so that everyone had time to adjust. And I let that hang there long enough for Diane to realize I was about to touch one of her favorite levers, and then I said that starting next year the head table would be occupied at the opening toast by the current scholarship recipients and the volunteers who had worked the hardest that season, and that everyone else, including me, would sit wherever they liked, and that the name cards would reflect contribution rather than status, which meant that if you spent your Saturdays reviewing applications or you drove a student to interviews, you would be at the front, and if your achievement was your job title alone, you would still be welcomed and applauded, but you would not be seated like a trophy. You could actually hear the sound of old rules cracking, not in a dramatic way, just in the shifting of chairs and the quick breaths and the rustle of a few people turning to look at Diane. who is a fast thinker and understood instantly that she could not argue against volunteers without outing her own priorities. So she clapped first and praised the spirit of the change and said, "What a beautiful way to honor our grandparents' idea of work." And I met her eyes and said I was glad we were aligned. And then I stepped away from the mic so there would be no performative back and forth, because the decision was made, the bylaw supported it, the treasurer would file it, and the room would teach itself the new reality. After that, everything softened in a way I did not expect, because once the hierarchy is not the entertainment, people relax. And kids who have never spoken to me asked if they could take a photo with the absurd trophy, and I said yes, as long as they promised to tell me one thing they were building that no one understood yet, and those tiny conversations were worth more than the applause. Because you could feel something correct itself, not perfectly, not forever, but enough, and even some of. The cousins who had been smirking since high school came by with a handshake that did not feel fake, which does not erase the years, but does make them smaller. Diane approached finally, still composed, still the queen of tone, and she said we would need to talk about logistics and messaging, and how to keep the table tradition elegant and inspiring, and I said we would. And that I would send a draft plan and a calendar invite, and we could co-sign the memo like grown-ups, and she gave me a look that held a lot of history and, to her credit, a grudging respect. And for once I did not translate that look into anything softer or meaner than it was, I just let it sit there between us like a new boundary. I left the trophy for the night so the kids could keep taking those photos, and I hugged Becca and thanked Uncle Ray and waved to the volunteer who had paged me twice and unknowingly helped knock down a wall, and as I picked up my bag, Diane said, in a voice that was very quiet and very precise, that she had not expected any of this, and I said, equally quiet, that I had, because I had built it, and then I walked out without needing to look back at a table that had defined me for too long. Because the best part about this kind of revenge is that it does not end with a parade, it ends with a simple shift that fixes the story for the next person who hears those words, "You do not belong," and learns, maybe for the first time, that she is allowed to decide where she sits.